Now in today's video, we're going to be kicking off a brand new mini-series here right on the channel. And it's one where you guys will be telling me exactly what to build. Now the new mini-series is going to be a bit of a game, and the rules to that game are pretty simple. I've actually reached out to a number of people on our Discord community, major followers and subscribers of the channel, and I've given them £150 to go out, find the parts to build a budget gaming PC, and send me the links so I can purchase them and put it together. The only parts that they don't need to actually go and find are the power supply and the case. I've actually provided them and they won't affect the performance of this system at all. And it also helps because it means I'm not going to actually blow anything up with some super cheap power supplies. And we have our first entry here. This system was actually designed by Neddy 990, and if anybody doesn't know who that is, it's one of our biggest and longest term followers of the channel. It's actually helped us out quite a bit here by providing us with donated parts and things like that for the studio. He also runs his own YouTube channels, one for gaming and one for 3D printing. So if anybody's into that kind of stuff, make sure you check it out. I'll put the links in the description below. The system that I've actually put together from his parts list though, I do think is a little bit on the safe side, particularly when you could pretty much buy anything you want. And I'm sure we're going to get some weird and wonderful things going forward. In terms of the platform, we did opt for a very basic 4th generation Intel platform. This is using a micro ATX board on a H81 system. Being such a budget board, of course, we're not going to get any kind of real overclocking off of it or anything, but I think it will be enough for what we've actually got in there. For the CPU, we've got the Intel Core i5-4690K, so that is an overclockable CPU, but obviously we're not going to be able to overclock on this motherboard, but it'll be fine anyway. For RAM, we have 16 gigabytes of DDR3, that's 2 sticks of 8 gigabytes, so again, pretty standard here, playing it safe, because that's the kind of RAM that you really do need for a gaming PC nowadays. For storage, we also have a 250GB SATA SSD, again playing it safe here because that is enough for a Windows install plus a number of other games, and of course being a SATA SSD it's going to be much better than a hard drive. And then when it comes to the graphics card, another safe option here of the AMD Radeon RX 580 8GB. I think overall for £150 he actually didn't do too bad, to be honest. But how much did he actually spend on the entire system? Well, he had a maximum of £150, and if we just run down through the parts now, for the CPU it actually cost him £15, and that was from CEX here in the UK. For the motherboard he spent £20 from eBay. 16GB of DDR3 actually cost £18 from CEX. The 250GB SATA SSD also only cost £15, and that again was from CEX. And then the Radeon RX 580 8GB was £72 from eBay. I do think that that is a little bit expensive if I'm totally honest, but you don't really have that much of a selection, particularly for the budget that we've got. Contestants for this also need to include their own cooler, which he opted for a stock Intel cooler, which will be more than efficient, which would cost around £5 from eBay itself, bringing the total to £145. So Neddy actually didn't spend the entire 150, he's not far off. There isn't a lot you can really buy for that kind of money, but of course he saved £5 on this, which will make more sense later on. Now of course contestants are only providing the parts. I have actually built this system and tried to get through any issues, and to be honest, with such a safe system like this there was no issues at all. Everything went together perfectly fine, Windows installed perfectly fine, even synthetic benchmarks worked perfectly fine, but the most important thing is how well it games, and to find that out I did some benchmarks. Now when it comes to benchmarking some of these older systems, of course we're not going to go flat out with our normal test suite here because they are very demanding games. We've actually decided to go with a new selection across multiple years, as well as different demands on the system. For our standard testing, we decided to try and tweak the system to get the best performance that we could, or at least the best settings that we felt that the system could provide. And starting with Grand Theft Auto 5, a very popular title still even today, this system managed to get a pretty decent average FPS here. Running it in 1080p with a high preset, we managed to get an average of 85 frames per second with a 1% low of 62. That of course means the game is more than playable, there was no stuttering at all, it's very smooth and it looks very good. The game here actually gets a near high FPS experience, and with those high settings, like I say, it does look extremely good, even though you do get the odd little dip here and there in those 1% lows, but nothing that took away from the gameplay. You could play this game perfectly fine all day on that. The next game in our testing was Mad Max. Now Mad Max is a new one to me, I haven't played it in a very long time, but it doesn't seem to be that much of a demanding game. It just seems to be very popular with people still. And running that game again in 1080p with a high preset, we managed to get a pretty decent average FPS here of 146 with a 1% low of 111. The game run beautifully smooth with this high FPS experience. There was absolutely no issues for the configuration we used, and it still looked amazing as well at these settings. Definitely a game you can play on this system. In The Witcher 3, running the game at 1080p with a medium preset this time, we did have to enable FSR2 with a balanced setting just to be able to get a 60 FPS experience here. With this configuration, we managed to get an average of 62 frames per second with a 1% low of 38. Of course, this is in the game's latest kind of version, so it does have a bit of a facelift here, and it looks very, very nice too. Shadow of the Tomb Raider isn't the most demanding game out there, but of course we are still talking about very oldish budget systems here, so running the game in 1080p, with this time with a high preset, we managed to get an average of 75 frames per second with a 1% low of 47. The game runs super smooth with this configuration, getting a decent 60 FPS experience, and with the high settings the game looked absolutely stunning, so it was a great experience overall. In Doom Eternal, running the game at 1080p with again a high preset, we managed to get an average of 113 frames per second with a 1% low of 79. As usual, the game runs super smooth on this system configuration with high settings and looking fantastic, and it could even be moved up to 1440p and it would still actually provide a 60 FPS experience, so that is a pretty awesome for a £150 machine. For the last game in our testing, we decided to kind of push the game a little bit, so we decided to test Cyberpunk 2077, still a very popular game today, and even though when it was released it was very demanding on systems, it has got much better over time with new updates and modifications. We ran this game in 1080p, but we did need to use a low preset here, as well as enable FSR 2.1 with a balance setting, and even then we could only achieve an average FPS of 44 with a 1% low of 16. Unfortunately, this game doesn't run very smooth on this configuration, and it really starts to show the limitations of such an old system. The game looks okay in low settings, but it just feels very sluggish due to those low 1% lows. Overall, the system did okay. Every game in our list would actually start, there were no errors, there was no VRAM warnings, so I think he made a few good choices here. But of course, we are playing a game here, and at some point there's got to be a bit of competition, so I decided to rerun all of these tests again using a very standard preset testing, just so that we can compare to others in future. The preset testing that we decided to go for was a 1080p high setting, so of course some of these games are really going to suffer here. In GTA 5 there was no change here, getting an average of 85 frames per second with a 1% low of 62. Mad Max again was exactly the same, with 146 frames per second on average and a 1% low of 111. In The Witcher 3 we could only achieve an average FPS of 56 frames per second with a 1% low of 14. That kind of made the game quite unplayable, I will admit. Those 1% lows were just too low to get any kind of smooth gameplay from it, even though the game did look very good in the high settings. Shadow of the Tomb Raider was still playable with these settings, getting an average of 75 frames per second with 1% low of 47. And of course there was no change with Doom Eternal here, getting an average of 113 frames per second with a 1% low of 79. Cyberpunk 2077 though was completely unplayable using this configuration, only now managing to get an average of 36 frames per second with a 1% low of 11. So Neddy's system overall didn't actually do that badly. If you are trying to run everything at a 1080p high setting, unfortunately it's not going to cut it for you, particularly when we get to some of those newer games. But if you do start to tweak some of those configurations, use some of AMD's latest upscaling technologies, you can actually get some pretty decent gaming experience out of it. But is it really a game with some competition without any kind of leaderboard? Of course it isn't. We've got some leaderboards. Neddy will be the first one going onto the leaderboard, so of course he's going to take first place for a while. And when we were deciding what kind of leaderboards we wanted, I thought maybe we should actually go for 2 scalings here, so at least other people will get an opportunity. The first leaderboard that we're going to have is a 6-game average. We tested 6 games in this, all with a nice preset of a 1080p high, and Neddy actually came out quite well at an average of 85 frames per second across all of those games. That of course puts him at the top of the board, but then again he is the only one there. We will see in time if he stays there. And then for the second leaderboard we decided to go for something around price and performance. That will give somebody else an opportunity to get up there, particularly if they can spend less and at least kind of nearly match that kind of average FPS across the 6 games. The 85 frames per second that he got on average across all 6 games actually cost him roughly around £1.70 per frame, so it's not too bad. Overall, I think Neddy did a pretty decent job on this system. He did play it a little bit safe in my opinion, going for a 4th generation system. We still know that a lot of those CPUs are reasonably capable, particularly when it comes to older games, and as well as pairing it with an 8GB graphics card, regardless of what type of graphics card it is, We know that even those modern games will require a little bit more grunt from that VRAM, and of course he covered it with that one. He is currently at the top of the leaderboards. Will he actually stay there? I don't know. We've got many systems to build into this, and we do have the next one in production already, so make sure you subscribe to the channel if you want to catch that. Let me know in the comments below, could you do any better than this system? What would you spend £150 on right now if you can actually just purchase the parts to build a budget system? Of course, not including the case or power supply, just to make things fair. And I'm sure, as always, I'll catch you guys in the next one.